The door didn't slam. It didn't creak. It didn't even make a sound. It simply closed. And when it did, Prince Harry realized something terrifying. This time, there was no handle on the other side. Let me ask you something right away. What if the biggest mistake Harry ever made wasn't leaving the royal family, but believing he could come back on his own terms? Because for months, quietly, confidently, almost arrogantly, a story had been circulating. A story whispered to journalists. A story hinted at through friends. A story dressed up as reconciliation, healing, and maturity. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Prince Harry and Meghan Markle were coming back to the UK. Not permanently, they said. Not dramatically, they promised. Just enough to re-enter the picture. Just enough to reset the narrative. Just enough to remind everyone that they were still royal. Whether the palace liked it or not. And for a while, it looked like it might work. Public fatigue was setting in. The monarchy was evolving. The world was changing. Surely, people thought, the future king would soften. Surely Prince William, the elder brother, the family man, the modern royal, would understand. Surely, he'd say yes. But what no one expected, not Harry, not Meghan, not even seasoned palace watchers, was how absolute the answer would be. I don't accept this. For words. No press release. No interview. No emotional speech. Just a line drawn so cleanly that everything on the other side stopped matching. And that's why this story matters right now. Because this wasn't a family argument. It wasn't sibling rivalry. It wasn't even about forgiveness. This was about power, control, and a future king deciding, quietly, that the chaos stops here. Think about it. When Harry left, the world framed it as rebellion, courage, escape, a prince choosing love over duty. The palace looked slow, stiff, outdated. But time has a funny way of flipping narratives. Because while Harry was speaking, explaining, justifying, releasing, reacting, William was doing something very different. He was watching. And that's the first contradiction people missed. Prince William didn't rage. He didn't retaliate publicly. He didn't rush to correct the record. He waited. Ask yourself, why would the most powerful man in the room ever raise his voice? Silence, in royal terms, isn't weakness. It's leverage. And Harry mistook that silence for flexibility. Behind the scenes, something else was forming. Advisors were shifting language. Invitations were being reconsidered. Access was narrowing. Not dramatically. Not obviously. Subtly. Because the plan Harry and Meghan were believed to be relying on wasn't confrontation. It was inevitability. The assumption was simple. The monarchy needs us. The family will bend. Public opinion will force reconciliation. But here's the part no one wanted to say out loud. Prince William doesn't think like that. He doesn't think in headlines. He doesn't think in emotional arcs. He thinks in structures, continuity, stability, containment. And once you see that, everything starts to make sense. Let me paint the scene. While speculation about a return swirled, William was stepping deeper into his future role. Not symbolically, practically. He wasn't preparing to be liked. He was preparing to lead. And leadership, especially in an institution like the monarchy, isn't about second chances. It's about risk management. Harry and Meghan weren't seen as family drama anymore. They were seen as variables, unpredictable ones. And here's where the story turns darker. Because Harry didn't just want access. He wanted legitimacy. He wanted the optics of being welcomed back, even partially, because optics rewrite history. If he could stand on British soil, attend select events, appear near the institution he once criticized, something powerful would happen. The narrative would blur. And once blurred, it becomes impossible to separate the monarchy from the criticism aimed at it. William understood that. That's why his response wasn't emotional. It was preventative. Now let me ask you something uncomfortable. If you were responsible for an institution that has survived wars, scandals, abdications, and centuries of pressure, would you risk it for sentiment? Or would you quietly protect it from the one threat it couldn't control? This is where Harry's blind spot becomes obvious. He believed blood guaranteed access. William believes behavior determines boundaries. And those are two completely different worlds. Behind closed doors, sources describe a shift, not an explosion, a cooling. Meetings where Harry's name stopped being discussed as a when and started being framed as an if. And eventually, not at all. No dramatic ban. No formal exile. just a reality where plans stopped including him. This is what people mean when they say Prince William destroyed the return plot. He didn't attack it. He made it irrelevant. And Meghan? She was reportedly confident that public sentiment could still be shaped. That enough pressure, enough sympathy, enough framing could soften the palace stance. But here's the contradiction. The more the outside noise increased, the more rigid the inside walls became. Because to William, noise equals instability. And instability is the one thing a future king cannot afford. Think about how chilling that is. Harry was fighting emotionally. William was defending structurally. Two brothers. Two strategies. Only one outcome. This wasn't a conversation anymore. It was containment. And when William allegedly said, "I don't accept this," he wasn't rejecting a visit. He was rejecting a pattern. A cycle of criticism followed by access. Distance followed by demand. Autonomy followed by entitlement. That cycle ended there. And this is where the public story diverges from the private reality. Because outwardly, nothing explosive happened. No breaking news banner saying, "Harry banned." No royal decree splashed across newspapers. But internally, the door closed. No handle. No negotiation. No timeline for reconsideration. And Harry felt it. People close to the situation describe confusion, frustration, a growing realization that something had shifted, and not temporarily. This wasn't about waiting for tempers to cool. This was about a new normal. And that's the most brutal part. Because you can fight anger. You can negotiate resentment. But you can't argue with indifference. William didn't need to destroy Harry publicly. He just needed to stop accommodating him privately. So now ask yourself this. What happens when a man who built his identity around being royal realizes the institution has learned how to function without him? What happens when the door you expected to reopen disappears? Because what came next wasn't louder. It was quieter and far more devastating. Harry thought coming back would be easier than leaving. That's what insiders say. Months of planning, quiet discussions, carefully timed media appearances, all suggesting that he believed the palace would eventually welcome him with open arms. The narrative was clear in his mind. Leave the UK, gain perspective, make a life abroad, and then return, on your terms, when you were ready. Simple, clean, controlled. But the truth is, it was never that simple. Ask yourself this. How many times in history has the royal family been flexible about a member who publicly criticized it, questioned its relevance, and made global headlines? Not often. In fact, very rarely. And that is where Harry's first miscalculation came in. He assumed that public sentiment was enough to override decades of protocol, centuries of precedent, and the personal convictions of the future king, his older brother. Let's back up a little. After stepping back from royal duties, Harry and Meghan established themselves in North America. They built brands, created media ventures, and redefined what it meant to be a modern royal. Interviews, documentaries, podcasts. They carefully curated moments that generated sympathy, admiration, or outrage, depending on the audience. They were effective at shaping the narrative globally. But in the UK, and inside the palace walls, these moves were watched differently. These weren't gestures of reconciliation, they were statements of leverage. Harry reportedly believed that a soft return was possible. A visit here, a charity event there, a few casual appearances, all without formally crossing the line back into royal duties. Meghan was said to be optimistic too, confident that public support could sway decisions. Together, they crafted a strategy that was subtle yet audacious. A return framed as a gesture of goodwill, a token of family unity, a reminder that despite everything, they were still part of the institution. But here's the crucial point. The palace doesn't operate on optimism. It operates on precedent, predictability, and control. A member of the royal family cannot simply walk back into favor based on media narratives or external pressure. Every movement is evaluated, every gesture assessed for impact on both the family and the institution. And the most critical person in this evaluation? Prince William. William didn't see a brother seeking reconciliation. He saw a plan being executed with the assumption that sentiment would be enough to force compliance. And for him, that assumption was fatal. Because to William, duty comes first. Personal feelings are secondary. And the stability of the monarchy is paramount. What's fascinating here is the contrast in approach. Harry approached this like a chessboard he could manipulate with clever moves and media attention. William approached it like a fortress that required careful maintenance and strategic defense. Harry's optimism was immediate, emotional, and public. William's response was deliberate, internal, and invisible to outsiders. The stage was set for a collision, not of words, but of worlds. Reports suggest that early in the return planning, Harry and Meghan tested the waters. Media leaks hinted at potential visits, softening public sentiment in preparation for an actual move. There were friendly interviews, subtle comments, and calculated public appearances. From the outside, it looked like momentum was on their side. They had supporters in the media and in public opinion, both of which they expected to leverage. But what Harry didn't anticipate was the silent monitoring occurring behind palace walls. Advisors, courtiers, and senior members were taking notes, observing patterns, and assessing potential risks. Unlike Harry, who moved in weeks and months, the palace operated in decades and centuries. Every action had historical context. Every gesture carried consequences far beyond the immediate moment. And William understood that all too well. One source familiar with the inner workings described a moment where the return narrative was presented to the palace leadership. The assumption was that enough strategic appearances, carefully framed messaging, and media-friendly behavior would soften resistance. But the response wasn't emotional, it was clinical. No speeches, no leaks, no warnings. Just a quiet recognition. Harry's plan might appear feasible on paper, but in reality, it was incompatible with the institution's priorities. Ask yourself this: what happens when optimism meets centuries of protocol? That's exactly what was about to unfold. Harry's next miscalculation was more personal. He assumed that his bloodline and previous service could override mistakes, perceived betrayals, and public criticism. There is a deeply ingrained belief in royal families, and perhaps in Harry himself, that family ties create a form of immunity. That love, loyalty, and shared history can always be leveraged to gain access. But William thinks differently. He doesn't see blood as leverage. He sees responsibility. And to him, Harry's actions had already demonstrated a lack of responsibility toward the institution and its continuity. Meanwhile, Meghan reportedly believed that charm, negotiation, and external pressure could influence the outcome. She saw public support as leverage, an invisible hand guiding the palace toward reconciliation. But here's the irony. The louder the narrative outside, the more rigid the walls inside. Public opinion, for all its power, cannot compel the monarchy to abandon its own rules. The palace thrives on structure, predictability, and control, not sympathy, outrage, or trends. And then came the moment that insiders describe as pivotal. Not a public confrontation, not a dramatic announcement, just a conversation, quiet, firm, final. William allegedly delivered the line that would change everything. "I don't accept this." 4 words. No elaboration. No public airing of grievances. Just a boundary, clear and unyielding. These words reportedly carried more weight than any press release or viral headline could. They weren't delivered in anger. They were delivered in certainty. And that certainty created a shift. Harry and Meghan's plan, carefully constructed and meticulously timed, suddenly collided with immovable resolve. The fascinating part of this dynamic is the psychology. Harry operated from a space of hope, assuming that connection, influence, and visibility could rewrite outcomes. William operated from a space of strategy, where boundaries and precedent dictated decisions. One approached the situation emotionally, the other structurally. And the contrast was stark. Sources indicate that after this refusal, internal conversations began to shift. Meetings that once entertained the possibility of a soft return now framed the discussion differently. The language changed from "when Harry comes back" to "if." Invitations and access points that had once seemed negotiable were quietly rescinded or reevaluated. The narrative of inevitability, which Harry had relied on, began to collapse. And yet, outwardly, nothing appeared to have changed. The public continued to see news of potential appearances, rumored reconciliations, and media leaks suggesting a softer outcome. But inside, the story was entirely different. The palace had effectively removed Harry's options without the fanfare of confrontation. Silence, in this context, became the ultimate weapon. Consider the irony. Harry believed he was gaining momentum through visibility. William was gaining control through invisibility. One is reactive, public, and immediate. The other is proactive, private, and enduring. And as the months unfolded, the pattern became increasingly clear. Every move by Harry and Meghan to force access was met not with reaction, but with calculated inaction. So let's pause here for a moment. Think about the stakes. What does it mean when the heir to the throne draws a line that cannot be crossed? What does it mean when access is no longer a matter of negotiation, but a matter of institutional integrity? And what does it mean for a brother who assumed that family ties would always guarantee entry? Because the answer is both simple and devastating. The door had closed, and there was no handle on the other side. Harry could have tried again, louder, smarter, more strategically. But the fundamental rules had changed. The palace wasn't reacting to emotion anymore. It was enforcing structure. And every strategic attempt by Harry was quietly absorbed, assessed, and nullified. By the end of this chapter in their lives, one truth became unavoidable. This wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about anger. It was about containment, about protecting continuity, about drawing boundaries that even love could not override. And in that containment, the narrative of reconciliation was effectively destroyed before it ever fully formed. And that's why this story is so compelling. Because it isn't just a tale of family conflict. It's a story about strategy, about power, and about understanding the rules of a system Harry assumed he could bend. The walls that protect centuries of monarchy are not visible in headlines, but they are immovable nonetheless. So here's the question you need to hold in your mind as we move forward. What happens next when the prince who expected welcome instead finds walls? What happens when the narrative you've built for months, carefully constructed, is suddenly irrelevant? And what comes after the line has been drawn, clearly and irrevocably, by the man who will one day sit on the throne? That's what insiders repeatedly emphasize when describing how the royal household handles crises. It's a mantra often lost in the noise of tabloids and social media. The public sees only headlines, dramatic interviews, and viral clips. The palace sees patterns. They see history. They see precedent, and they act accordingly. When Harry and Meghan left the UK, many assumed the palace would eventually forgive, accommodate, and allow some form of return. After all, isn't family supposed to bridge distance? Isn't blood supposed to carry weight? Not in this institution. The monarchy is not a friendship. It is a living, breathing system, and every action taken within it reverberates far beyond a single moment. What happened 5, 10, even 20 years ago is never forgotten. It is noted, remembered, and often used as context for every future decision. That's why William's handling of Harry's attempted return was so precise and so devastatingly effective. You see, Harry believed he could rewrite history with optics. A few well-placed interviews, carefully timed charitable events, strategic appearances. He thought media pressure could bend centuries of protocol. He thought nostalgia for his childhood and the public's affection would be enough to get him back in the door. But the palace remembers. And more importantly, it takes notes. Let's break that down. What does taking notes really mean in this context? It isn't literally writing down Harry's every move. It's tracking behavior, analyzing patterns, predicting consequences, and creating a mental dossier of what can and cannot be allowed. Every interview, every social media post, every public statement from Harry and Meghan was cataloged. Every loyalty shift, every perceived slight, every claim about the monarchy, recorded and assessed. Now, you might be thinking, isn't that overkill? Isn't that paranoia? Not at all. This is how an institution that has survived wars, abdications, political upheavals, and global scrutiny operates. The monarchy doesn't move on emotion, it moves on strategy. And strategy is built on memory. And this is where Harry's first major blind spot emerges. While he assumed public sentiment could override the palace's internal record, he underestimated the weight of history in their calculations. Every step he thought was forward was already measured against decades of precedent. Every move he believed was a gain was secretly evaluated as a risk. And every expectation of leniency was quietly discounted. William understood this implicitly. He didn't need to confront Harry directly. He didn't need to issue ultimatums or stage public rebukes. The palace's memory did the work for him. Every prior act, interviews, critiques, departures, served as a justification to deny the return. And this isn't just theoretical. Sources describe internal conversations where advisors repeatedly stressed, "We cannot treat this as a negotiation. We must treat it as a precedent." Let me pause for a moment and highlight something crucial. Precedent isn't just about fairness, it's about survival. The monarchy depends on rules that are predictable, enforceable, and consistent. If one member can flout norms, receive forgiveness, and then return with privileges intact, the entire system is destabilized. This is why the palace's response was so quiet yet so effective. Publicly, there were no headlines condemning Harry, no official statements barring him from the country, no dramatic speeches. But internally, the message was clear: the door is not open. It is not partially open. It is closed, and it will remain so until trust is rebuilt, behavior changes, and history is taken into account. Contrast this with Harry's approach. He operates on momentum, visibility, and emotion. He believed that timing, optics, and public opinion could create pressure strong enough to force compliance. He assumed that the palace would eventually soften, that William would eventually yield, that Meghan's charm and influence would tip the scales. And yet, history and memory are impervious to optics. The palace doesn't forget. It doesn't bend for sentiment. And in William's eyes, allowing Harry back without accountability would not be reconciliation, it would be chaos. This is where William's strategic genius comes into play. He didn't respond with emotion. He responded with calculation. He didn't try to win a public argument. He didn't need to. By taking notes, by assessing history, and by relying on precedent, he effectively neutralized the return before it even began. Here's a critical point to understand. This wasn't about pettiness. It wasn't about revenge. It was about control, about protecting the institution, about making sure that when the family welcomes someone back, it is under terms that are sustainable, responsible, and in line with centuries of continuity. And this is why the contrast between the brothers is so stark. Harry measures success by immediacy, by optics, by emotional wins. William measures success by longevity, by stability, by maintaining a system that has endured generations. And those two approaches, as you can imagine, rarely intersect harmoniously. Sources indicate that as the months went on, the palace began quietly restructuring access. Invitations that once seemed possible were rescinded or never sent. Opportunities that might have allowed Harry to reintegrate were quietly reevaluated. The narrative of soft return began to erode, and the more public attention increased, the more rigid the internal structures became. Think about that for a second. Public pressure, which Harry assumed would create leverage, actually reinforced the palace's boundaries. The louder the world cheered for reconciliation, the more the institution dug in. Noise outside equaled control inside. That's a paradox few people fully understand. And here's the most striking part. William wasn't reacting emotionally. He wasn't lashing out or retaliating. He was building the reality in which Harry's plan could not succeed. Every decision, every omission, every internal note contributed to a system where the return was impossible, not because it was forbidden, but because the conditions necessary for it no longer existed. It's a subtle distinction, but a devastatingly effective one. Harry believed he could manipulate the system with charm and optics. William understood that the system doesn't bend for charm. It bends for accountability, precedent, and stability. This is why insiders describe the moment William allegedly said, "I don't accept this," as pivotal. It wasn't a rejection of Harry personally. It wasn't about anger or vengeance. It was about enforcing the lessons of history, ensuring that precedent remained unbroken, and maintaining the continuity of the monarchy. And once that line was drawn, everything shifted. The conversations changed. The internal assessments changed. The very possibility of a return, even a soft one, disappeared. Now ask yourself, what happens when an entire institution remembers, takes notes, and acts quietly while the world thinks it's moving on sentiment? That's exactly what happened here. Harry's narrative of return, meticulously crafted and carefully timed, collided with an immovable force, the palace's memory and William's strategic resolve. By the time Harry realized the scale of the obstacle, it was too late. The plan wasn't just failing, it was irrelevant. The door had closed quietly, but the impact was absolute. And this is where the story becomes truly fascinating. Because the palace's memory doesn't just stop at denial. It informs every decision going forward. Every potential interaction, every public appearance, every future negotiation is now framed by what has already been recorded. The lesson is clear. Actions have consequences. History is always remembered, and the system cannot be manipulated with optics alone. So here's the question that lingers. What happens to someone who misjudges the power of memory, precedent, and quiet authority? What happens when the institution you tried to influence has already accounted for every move you thought would work? And what comes next when a line has been drawn with such precision that no charm, no pressure, and no public outcry can erase it? What worked in Hollywood doesn't always work in a monarchy. It's a statement insiders make over and over again when discussing Meghan Markle's approach to reintegration. In the world of celebrity, charm, media influence, and narrative control can open doors, smooth over conflicts, and create rapid outcomes. But the palace operates under a completely different set of rules. Rules Meghan learned the hard way. When Meghan first considered the possibility of a return, she reportedly believed that her public influence could create leverage. Interviews, documentaries, social media campaigns, and strategic appearances were all part of a subtle plan. Her logic was simple: sway public opinion, create sympathy, and the palace would be pressured into action. She assumed that the institution was reactive to perception, much like Hollywood studios responding to fan campaigns or viral stories. That was her first miscalculation. The royal family doesn't operate on perception. It operates on precedent, protocol, and calculated control. A single public figure cannot alter centuries of tradition with charm alone. Every action Meghan took was evaluated against internal rules, historical patterns, and potential impact on continuity. And while the public might cheer, the palace doesn't adjust based on applause. It adjusts based on structure. Think about the irony here. Meghan, skilled in influencing perception, assumed visibility equaled leverage. She assumed that a well-timed interview or a viral story could soften boundaries. But the louder the external narrative grew, the more internally rigid the palace became. Noise outside became reinforcement inside. Public pressure, in other words, didn't create opportunities. It fortified the existing limitations. There's more. Meghan reportedly believed that William's personal affection for Harry could be leveraged, that familial bonds, shared history, and emotional connections would override structural concerns. But William doesn't operate from sentiment. He operates from principle and responsibility. He measures loyalty, trustworthiness, and accountability above all else. Meghan's confidence and charm misjudged not only William's approach, but also the weight of institutional memory, the cumulative effect of every slight, every misstep, every controversial interview. And there's the paradox. Meghan is exceptionally intelligent, calculating, and media savvy. She understands influence and optics better than most. But those very tools, effective in Hollywood, can misfire when applied to an institution like the British monarchy. Subtlety is perceived differently. Charm is scrutinized more harshly, and strategy must account for history. In other words, what seems persuasive in one world is irrelevant in another. Sources close to the palace describe several key missteps. First, Meghan allegedly underestimated the scrutiny applied to every move. Every media appearance, every statement, and every gesture was meticulously assessed by advisors. Every perceived slight, past or present, was contextualized. The palace doesn't see behavior in isolation. It sees patterns, and patterns matter far more than intentions. Second, Meghan reportedly misread the importance of silence. In Hollywood, visibility is power. In the palace, silence is authority. Where she expected engagement, she encountered discretion. Where she anticipated discussion, she faced inaction. And where she sought leverage, she encountered structure. Third, Meghan may have miscalculated the role of timing. The assumption that a soft return could be orchestrated gradually failed to account for the pace at which William was consolidating his future authority. The heir to the throne doesn't wait for timing to become convenient. He acts when the institution demands it. And by the time Meghan realized how inflexible the system could be, many opportunities had quietly evaporated. This miscalculation is critical to understanding the dynamic between the siblings. Harry, for all his optimism, believed in momentum, visibility, and emotional argument. Meghan believed in influence, charm, and leverage. William, in contrast, believed in structure, precedent, and control. And in this clash of approaches, the palace's rules ultimately held sway. Here's where it gets particularly interesting. Meghan's influence, which she assumed would create openings, actually highlighted limitations. Every media-friendly action became a reference point for advisors. Every attempt to frame a narrative reinforced boundaries. And every public appeal, meant to create empathy, reminded the palace why access had been restricted in the first place. Imagine the tension. A couple highly skilled in communication, carefully crafting public perception, facing an institution that sees only patterns and precedents. The more they spoke, the more internally rigid the response became. Every outward attempt at influence collided with invisible barriers. And these barriers were being actively maintained by William, whose priority was not to punish but to protect. One insider described a key moment in these early months. A meeting where advisors reportedly presented Meghan's planned return strategy. The assessment wasn't harsh. It wasn't emotional. It was analytical. "This is not about her intentions," an advisor allegedly said. "This is about the rules, the history, and what the institution can tolerate. Right now, that door is closed." Another source emphasizes a cultural gap. Hollywood, where Meghan's experience lies, celebrates narrative control and rapid influence. The monarchy, in contrast, measures actions over decades. Influence is assessed over generations, not weeks. And in this context, her attempts to leverage external pressure were, ironically, counterproductive. There's also a human element. Meghan reportedly became frustrated as she recognized that visibility and charm were not producing results. Her instinct, honed in a world where public perception is often decisive, suggested she could create change. The palace, however, responded not with reaction but with structural patience. The frustration she felt, insiders say, became part of the dynamic that widened the gap between expectation and reality. So, the miscalculation is clear. The tools that had served Meghan in one arena were ineffective and even counterproductive in another. Charm cannot rewrite precedent. Media coverage cannot bend centuries of tradition. Influence cannot replace accountability. Meanwhile, William observed. He did not need to engage in public confrontation. He did not need to counter with media statements or leaks. The palace's quiet, methodical response achieved exactly what loud opposition could not. Every attempt at leverage was absorbed, cataloged, and neutralized. And Meghan, perhaps more than anyone else, realized the limits of her power in a system she had entered but not fully understood. And here's the last piece. Meghan's miscalculation wasn't just about strategy. It was about underestimating the psychological dynamics at play. She assumed emotion could override history. She assumed visibility could override structure. She assumed charm could override precedent. But William doesn't operate in that space. His focus is long-term, protective, and unwavering. And in that gap, the return plan began to unravel. Ask yourself this. How often do we overestimate influence in environments built to resist it? How often do we misjudge systems because they operate under rules we cannot see? And how does it feel to realize that every carefully calculated move, every effort at persuasion, every attempt to leverage visibility has been quietly countered by an invisible force? And that's exactly what Meghan was learning. By the end of these early months, the situation was clear. The palace wasn't moving. Harry and Meghan's soft return wasn't being blocked by anger or public drama. It was being blocked by structure, memory, and principle. And every attempt to create openings was increasingly ineffective. So here's the cliffhanger. Meghan believed influence could work. Harry believed momentum would work. But William believed in permanence. And once permanence is established, no charm, no strategy, and no narrative can undo it. There was a moment, a single, pivotal moment. And after that, nothing could be undone. Sources describe it as quiet, almost imperceptible to outsiders. No headlines, no interviews, no viral social media clips. But inside the palace, it changed everything. This was the moment Prince William stopped negotiating. Let's rewind a bit. Up until this point, there was still a glimmer of possibility. Harry and Meghan were testing boundaries. Advisors were quietly considering options. A return, in theory, was still plausible, if certain conditions were met. It wasn't guaranteed, but it hadn't been shut down entirely. William understood that. He also understood the risk of appearing inflexible too early. Public perception matters, even when you are heir to the throne. The monarchy relies not just on rules, but on credibility. Acting prematurely could be misinterpreted as vindictiveness or weakness. But then came the moment. According to insiders, it occurred during a private discussion where advisors presented Harry's latest proposals for returning to the UK. They were framed carefully, designed to appear cooperative and palatable. Soft appearances, charity events, limited engagements, and incremental reintegration. Harry's team, confident as ever, assumed the proposals would at least be entertained. William, however, had reached a conclusion long before the conversation began. He had reviewed the patterns, weighed the history, and anticipated every potential move. And in that room, he decided the negotiation would end. No one outside will ever know the exact words spoken, but insiders repeatedly describe a line, delivered calmly, without drama, that signaled finality. I don't accept this. For words. That's all it took. This wasn't a threat. It wasn't a warning. It wasn't a negotiation tactic. It was a boundary, a line drawn with clarity, a principle established. And it carried consequences Harry and Meghan were only beginning to comprehend. Here's why it was so devastating. First, it wasn't public. There was no spectacle, no viral moment, no dramatic confrontation. To the world, the status quo appeared unchanged. But internally, the decision set off a chain reaction that would quietly dismantle the return plan. Invitations were reconsidered, access points reevaluated, and advisors began reframing conversations to reflect a new reality. Second, the decision wasn't emotional. It wasn't driven by anger, frustration, or rivalry. William's approach was strategic, deliberate, and long-term. The palace doesn't operate on emotion, it operates on principle. And the principle in play here was clear. The monarchy cannot bend for optics, sentiment, or momentum. Access must be earned, boundaries respected, and precedent upheld. Third, it created inevitability. Once the line was drawn, every subsequent action by Harry and Meghan was filtered through that framework. Their strategies, previously viable, were suddenly irrelevant. Their leverage, previously assumed to be strong, was now neutralized. And every attempt to force the issue only reinforced the palace's stance. Now, you might be wondering, why didn't William just confront Harry publicly? Why maintain silence? The answer lies in control. Public confrontation carries risks. It invites scrutiny, invites debate, and allows others to influence the narrative. Silence, however, is far more powerful. By quietly refusing the return, William controlled the environment without creating an unnecessary spectacle. He let the institution act as its own barrier, leaving Harry and Meghan's options increasingly constrained without anyone outside noticing. Insiders describe a striking contrast between the brothers. Harry's approach was urgent, immediate, reactive. He relied on emotion, visibility, and momentum. William's approach was measured, patient, and preventative. While Harry acted in weeks, William acted in years. While Harry measured success by optics, William measured success by sustainability. And in this difference lies the core of why the negotiation failed. At this moment, advisors reportedly began reconfiguring internal plans. Invitations that had once been under consideration were quietly rescinded. Access points were analyzed and restricted. Opportunities that might have allowed incremental reintegration were removed, replaced with contingency plans designed to maintain structure and avoid risk. This is the subtlety of William's strategy. There was no drama, no confrontation, just quiet, calculated containment. Every move Harry or Meghan made after that point was absorbed, assessed, and neutralized, and they may not have realized it until it was too late. Consider the psychology of this. Harry expected a negotiation, a discussion, a path forward. Meghan expected influence, leverage, and persuasion. William delivered neither. He provided clarity, stability, and finality. The contrast is striking. One side relied on emotion and optics. The other relied on structure and principle. And structure, as it turns out, always wins in the palace. This moment also highlights William's understanding of legacy. The future king isn't measured by popularity or sympathy. He is measured by the stability of the institution he will inherit. And allowing a member who has publicly criticized and distanced himself to reintegrate without accountability would compromise that stability. William recognized that the cost of accommodation outweighed any benefit. By stopping negotiations, he didn't just reject a proposal. He redefined the parameters of what was possible. He turned a fluid situation into a fixed one. And that fixity is what made the palace's response so effective. It wasn't about denial. It was about creating a framework where reconciliation could only occur under controlled, principled circumstances. Let's also address the human element. This was not personal animosity. Sources emphasize that William's decision was guided by duty, not emotion. He wasn't angry. He was responsible. The monarchy, unlike ordinary families, cannot operate on sentiment. It operates on rules, precedent, and continuity. And in that space, his refusal was both logical and inevitable. And here's the kicker. While the public might speculate endlessly about potential reconciliations, leaks, and media appearances, the reality is much quieter and more powerful. The decision to stop negotiating reshapes every subsequent interaction. Every meeting, every invitation, every engagement is now evaluated against this decision. The line has been drawn, and crossing it carries consequences that cannot be undone. Ask yourself this. What does it feel like to be on the other side of that line? To assume momentum and influence are sufficient, only to discover that your path has been closed not through confrontation, but through quiet, deliberate strategy? That is the reality Harry and Meghan faced. Sources suggest that the impact was immediate. Advisors adjusted plans, media teams recalibrated expectations, and internal communications began framing Harry and Meghan's options as increasingly limited. What had once seemed negotiable was now effectively impossible. The palace's memory, principle, and structure were working in unison, neutralizing the return quietly but decisively. And this is where the story grows even more intense. Because the moment William stopped negotiating was also the moment the dynamic between the brothers fundamentally changed. No longer was it a question of influence or persuasion. It was a question of boundaries, authority, and permanence. Harry could try again. He could launch media campaigns, leaks, or public appeals. But the framework had shifted. Every move he made would now be absorbed into a system designed to maintain control. And the more aggressive he became, the more the palace could justify its refusal. Let's not underestimate the magnitude of this moment. A single line, delivered calmly and with certainty, reshaped months of planning, years of anticipation, and decades of assumptions. The door Harry thought would be open for negotiation had quietly closed, and William had ensured that the closure was total, principled, and irreversible without extraordinary circumstances. So here's the cliffhanger. Stopping negotiation wasn't the end, it was the beginning. A chain reaction was about to unfold that would reveal just how carefully William had orchestrated the palace's response, and how Harry and Meghan's strategies, once powerful in their own right, were now entirely irrelevant. If you think the story of Harry and Meghan's attempted return is only about the siblings, think again. There's an entire battlefield most people never see, the palace advisors. They are the unseen architects, the quiet strategists, and the keepers of precedent. And in this conflict, their influence was decisive. Let's be clear, advisors don't make the rules. They enforce them, interpret them, and ensure the family operates within them. But their work is far from passive. Every conversation, every note, every assessment shapes outcomes. In the months following William's decision to stop negotiating, the palace advisors were quietly waging what some insiders call a silent war to maintain control. What does that mean exactly? Imagine a chessboard. Every piece has a role, every move is calculated, and every potential threat is mapped. Harry's return was a threat, not because of him personally, but because of what his presence implied: precedent, optics, and potential disruption. The advisors recognized this and began systematically neutralizing it, without the public ever knowing. Step 1. Access control. Every invitation, every potential engagement, Every interaction with senior royals was quietly reviewed. Advisors flagged risks, evaluated optics, and prepared contingency plans. Opportunities that seemed possible in earlier months were now deemed high risk and removed from consideration. Where Harry and Meghan expected flexibility, they encountered invisible walls. Step 2. Narrative management. The palace is acutely aware of public perception. But here's the key. Public perception is not the same as internal reality. Advisors carefully curated what leaked, what stayed private, and how discussions were framed for the media. The goal wasn't to deceive the public, but to prevent Harry and Meghan from gaining leverage through perception. Every rumor, every report, every soft return story had to be carefully counterbalanced by internal restraint. Step 3. Precedent reinforcement. Advisors meticulously reviewed every past instance where family members challenged protocol or tested boundaries. They presented William with comprehensive analyses, demonstrating the long-term consequences of bending rules. These historical lessons reinforced the decision to deny access, providing both strategic clarity and institutional justification. Now consider the psychological impact. Harry and Meghan operated in a world of visibility. Their influence is measured by headlines, interviews, and public sentiment. The palace, in contrast, measures influence through stability, structure, and control. Every advisor action was designed to ensure that Harry's world and the palace's world could not intersect in ways that threatened continuity. Sources suggest that advisors even anticipated potential media maneuvers. They considered leaks, sympathetic interviews, and social media narratives. Every potential move by Harry and Meghan was evaluated for risk, and every countermeasure was planned quietly. In essence, the advisors were building a fortress around the decision to deny return. And this fortress was invisible to outsiders. One insider describes a key internal meeting. Advisors reviewed Harry's past interviews, Meghan's public statements, and every reported interaction with the palace. The assessment was methodical. Each attempt at persuasion, each media campaign, each rumored return was cataloged and rated for risk. By the end of the session, the team had a comprehensive strategy to maintain boundaries, enforce precedent, and neutralize influence. All without creating public spectacle. This is where the concept of silent war becomes important. Harry and Meghan's plan relied on momentum, visibility, and perception. The advisors' plan relied on discretion, historical analysis, and containment. One is loud and reactive. The other is quiet, preventive, and enduring. And in the end, quiet wins. Every time. Another layer to consider: internal alignment. Advisors don't operate in isolation. They coordinate with senior royals, security, communications teams, and legal counsel. Every message, every decision, every adjustment is reinforced by multiple layers of oversight. By the time Harry and Meghan realized the palace was resisting, they weren't just facing William. They were facing an entire system prepared to maintain control. And yet, there's a subtle genius here. The advisors didn't simply block attempts. They shaped the environment in which attempts became irrelevant. Every media appearance by Meghan was cataloged, assessed, and reframed. Every charitable engagement considered for Harry was quietly deprioritized. Every soft return, narrative outside was absorbed internally and neutralized. Think about the psychology of that. You believe you are creating momentum. You believe you are gaining leverage. But internally, every move you make strengthens the very boundary you are trying to overcome. It's subtle, strategic, and psychologically devastating. This is where Harry's miscalculation is most evident. He assumed influence could overcome structure. He assumed public support could override history. He assumed momentum could bend rules. But the advisors ensured that influence, support, and momentum were absorbed, analyzed, and nullified. Every attempt at leverage became a reinforcement of boundaries. And here's the kicker. Advisors are experts at invisibility. Their work is effective precisely because it is unseen. To the public, nothing appears to be happening. To Harry and Meghan, every effort seems possible. But internally, the system is being meticulously maintained, every weak point identified, every potential breach anticipated. By the time Harry realized the scope of resistance, it was already too late. The silent war had been won before it was ever noticed. Every pathway for a soft return had been quietly closed. Every narrative advantage had been neutralized, and every expectation that media attention could compel change had been proven false. At this point, the stakes grew even higher. Harry and Meghan's attempts to apply pressure risked backfiring. The more public attention they drew, the more internally rigid the palace became. The advisor's strategy was simple: contain, assess, and neutralize. Public drama only reinforced internal discipline, and it worked. The palace didn't need to confront Harry or Meghan. They didn't need to make headlines. They didn't need to explain themselves to the world. They simply maintained structure. And structure, in this scenario, was lethal. Ask yourself this: how often do we underestimate invisible systems? How often do we assume momentum and influence are enough to override history and structure? And how does it feel when every move you make strengthens the barriers you're trying to break? By the end of this chapter in the saga, one thing is clear: Harry and Meghan were not just facing William. They were facing an entire institution, strategically aligned, historically informed, and quietly undefeated. The silent war had begun, and the palace was winning. Here's the irony: Harry and Meghan tried to use the media as their weapon, but it became a trap instead. From the outside, it looked like a smart strategy. Interviews, leaks, carefully crafted appearances. They created public momentum, shaped narratives, and generated sympathy. The world was watching. Supporters rallied. Headlines praised bravery, called for reconciliation, and painted Harry and Meghan as the victims of an unyielding system. On paper, it seemed brilliant. But insiders say the palace anticipated every move. Every media tactic was cataloged, every statement analyzed, and every appearance reframed internally. The more Harry and Meghan sought visibility, the more it backfired strategically. The palace didn't need to counteract the media publicly. They simply let it play out while maintaining complete control behind the scenes. Think about that for a second. Outwardly, it seemed like the world was on Harry and Meghan's side. But inside, every public gesture was feeding a larger narrative the palace controlled, one where access was restricted, boundaries were enforced, and precedent was unbreakable. The louder the media noise, the more resolute the internal response became. This is why insiders refer to the media trap. Every viral story, every sympathetic headline, every trending tweet was a double-edged sword. It amplified the perception that Harry and Meghan were entitled to a return, but simultaneously reinforced the palace's determination to deny it. Momentum outside only strengthened the walls inside. One source described a particularly telling incident. A widely publicized interview was scheduled to coincide with charity events in the UK, suggesting that the palace might be forced into accommodating them. But internally, advisors and senior royals used it as evidence of strategy-driven persistence rather than reconciliation. The palace's assessment: if they were willing to orchestrate public pressure, they were prioritizing optics over institutional respect. That alone justified continued restriction. This is where Meghan's previous miscalculations became painfully evident. She assumed that public support could sway decisions. She assumed that narrative control would equal influence. She assumed the palace operated in the same world as Hollywood. But it doesn't. Not even close. In fact, the more external pressure applied, the more disciplined and unmoved the internal mechanisms became. The public momentum didn't open doors, it highlighted the boundaries. Harry, meanwhile, misread the dynamics. He believed media attention was leverage. He believed public sympathy equated to influence. He believed that once he gained enough visibility, the palace would relent. But the advisors had already factored every potential move into a risk assessment. Every article, every segment, every leak was noted, cataloged, and neutralized in internal planning. Momentum outside meant nothing without compliance inside. There's a lesson here. Perception is not power when structure is invisible and unyielding. Harry and Meghan's attempts to shape the narrative only played into the palace's strategy. Each story, each viral moment, reinforced why access had been restricted. Every sympathetic headline became an example of strategy over sentiment. And then came the psychological toll. Sources indicate that Harry and Meghan began to feel frustration and disbelief as they realized their media efforts weren't producing results. Their natural instincts, to fight back, to create headlines, to rally public opinion, were ineffective. In fact, they were counterproductive. What they thought was leverage was actually reinforcement of the palace's unmovable position. This is where William's quiet genius becomes clear. By refusing to publicly engage, by letting the media run its course, he maintained ultimate control. Every public perception of Harry and Meghan's influence was, in reality, irrelevant. The palace operated independently of optics, guided by history, precedent, and principle. And in that environment, the media became a self-defeating weapon for Harry and Meghan. Insiders describe it like a game of chess. Harry and Meghan moved publicly, visible to all. William moved privately, unseen, strategically positioning every piece. By the time Harry realized the impact, every move had been anticipated, every attempt neutralized. The media, meant to be a tool, had become a cage. And yet, Harry didn't immediately recognize the trap. He kept pushing. Interviews, social media commentary, philanthropic appearances, all designed to generate visibility. But each attempt only highlighted his reliance on momentum and his lack of leverage over an institution that values structure above all. Meanwhile, the advisors were quietly reinforcing control. Contingency plans, access restrictions, and internal communications ensured that the palace could remain unmoved, even under intense external pressure. No public backlash, no viral headline, no sympathetic story could alter the carefully maintained framework. It's also worth noting that the media trap had an unintended emotional effect. Harry reportedly became frustrated, anxious, and even desperate as he saw his plans failing to yield results. Meghan, equally media-savvy, began to feel the limits of her influence. What worked in Hollywood, visibility, narrative control, public persuasion, was ineffective in a system built to resist it. Every attempt to force the palace's hand only confirmed the internal boundaries. By this point, the dynamic between the siblings had shifted. Harry relied on momentum. Meghan relied on influence. William relied on permanence. The media, intended as a weapon for Harry and Meghan, became proof of their miscalculation. Every headline that cheered them on underscored why the palace's quiet, structured approach was winning. And then came the pivotal internal realization. Advisors reportedly presented William with an analysis of every public appearance, every media leak, and every sympathetic story. The conclusion was simple: do nothing publicly. Let the noise continue. Let Harry and Meghan believe they have leverage. Internally, maintain structure, enforce boundaries, and uphold precedent. The media will do the rest by reinforcing the invisibility of control. The brilliance of this approach is subtle but devastating. Harry and Meghan could see the stories, could feel public support, could assume they were winning. But every effort only tightened the palace's hold. The media became a mirror reflecting their failure rather than their success. By the end of this chapter in the saga, one thing is clear. The palace didn't just resist Harry and Meghan's return. They absorbed, evaluated, and neutralized every move. The media, meant to be an ally, became a cage of perception, reinforcing the very limitations they sought to overcome. Ask yourself this: how often do we mistake visibility for influence? How often do we assume momentum is power when the system itself is invisible and unyielding? And how does it feel to realize that every attempt at leverage has been quietly neutralized by a combination of structure, memory, and principle? This is where the story takes a shocking turn. One that very few outside the palace walls even suspected. Behind the scenes, there exists a document so carefully crafted that it could determine the fate of Harry and Meghan's return before they even attempted it. Insiders refer to it simply as the hidden clause. The clause is not some secret, sensational legal loophole. It is a provision embedded in the protocols surrounding access, privileges, and the use of royal titles, designed to protect the institution from exactly the type of disruption Harry and Meghan were attempting. And when William and the senior advisors reviewed the situation, the clause became the ultimate tool of enforcement. Think about that. A single clause, quiet, unpublicized, and unassuming, had the power to override public opinion, media pressure, and even Harry's carefully orchestrated momentum. It didn't require confrontation, it didn't require headlines, and it didn't require emotional arguments. It only required precision, principle, and the authority of the monarchy. According to sources, the hidden clause was inserted years ago, following past conflicts where family members attempted to leverage media and public sentiment against protocol. It wasn't created for Harry or Meghan specifically, but it applied perfectly to their situation. It's a legal and procedural safeguard. Access, privileges, and even soft appearances can be contingent upon adherence to certain behavioral expectations, the demonstration of loyalty, and the repair of family relationships. Imagine the frustration Harry and Meghan must have felt. Every media campaign, every sympathetic story, every carefully timed appearance was now operating against a built-in, internal safeguard they didn't know existed. The clause wasn't public. It wasn't discussed, but it was real, enforceable, and non-negotiable. The genius of it lies in its invisibility. To the outside world, Harry and Meghan were free to plan their return, promote their image, and build momentum. Internally, however, the palace could say, access is conditional. Privileges are conditional. Until conditions are met, the door remains closed. And because the clause is procedural and legal, it is impossible to argue around. It is simply the rule. Sources describe the internal discussions as calm but decisive. Advisors reminded William and senior royals that the clause existed precisely for situations like this. They could maintain control without creating a spectacle, without leaking information, and without public confrontation. It was a tool of quiet authority, and it was about to be used. Harry's miscalculation becomes even clearer in this context. He believed momentum could bend precedent. He believed media influence could override rules. He believed public pressure could open doors. But the hidden clause made all of these attempts irrelevant. Visibility, optics, and charm do not satisfy procedural requirements. Only adherence, accountability, and repair do. And Meghan's misjudgment, once again, is striking. She assumed the media would create leverage, that her narrative could shift the palace's response, that influence could override internal law. But law, history, and structure are not swayed by perception. And this clause embodies that reality. The system is designed to resist manipulation, to enforce boundaries, and to maintain continuity, even under immense external pressure. Here's where it gets personal. According to insiders, William